Sometimes a father's love means running toward the unknown, even when you're already running from everything else. When you've lost your job, your home, and nearly your hope, $5 for a forgotten cabin in the woods feels like a miracle until you realize some places are abandoned for good reason. He brought his young son to start over in the quiet pines, far from the questions and judgment of their old life. But the moment they opened that creaking door, a barefoot girl stepped from the shadows. She was wild-eyed and silent, like something that belonged more to the forest than to civilization. Days passed before she spoke, drawing strange symbols in the dirt and watching them with eyes that held secrets. Animals started disappearing. Tools went missing. Then came the screams from the woods at night. His son began whispering to her in the darkness, sharing conversations he couldn't hear. The cabin hadn't just been left empty, it had been sealed shut. What ancient terror had they set free simply by coming home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered property deed lay crumpled on the truck's dashboard, its edges yellowed with age and bearing water stains that made some of the text illegible. Terrence Washington had folded and unfolded it so many times over the past 3 days that the creases had worn soft as fabric. $5. That's all it had cost him at the county auction, $5. For 40 acres of Montana wilderness and whatever. Structure sat rotting in the middle of it. He'd been desperate, enough to bid on something sight unseen, which should have been his first warning. But when you're down to your last $150 and your 8-year-old son keeps asking why they can't go home anymore, desperation makes you do things that reasonable men wouldn't. Consider Dot. The truck's engine coughed as they climbed the winding dirt road deeper into the Bitterroot Mountains. Pine trees crowded close on both sides, their branches scraping against the windows like fingers trying to claw their way inside. October had already touched the higher elevations with frost, and the aspens showed gold against the evergreen backdrop. It was beautiful country, Terrence had to admit, but it felt empty in a way that went beyond the absence of other people. "Dad, are we there yet?" Jaden asked from the passenger seat, his small hands pressed against the window. At 8, he was old enough to understand that their lives had changed, but young enough to still believe his father could fix anything. Should be just up ahead. "Son," Terrence checked the hand-drawn map the county clerk had provided. According to the scratchy pencil marks, they should have reached the cabin 10 minutes ago, but the road kept winding deeper into the wilderness, as if the forest itself was reluctant to give up its secrets. 3 years had passed since Angela's death, and Terrence still caught himself looking for her in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her gentle smile, encouraging him through another difficult decision. She'd been the practical one, the planner who could stretch a dollar until it screamed, and somehow make their cramped Detroit apartment feel like a palace. When the cancer took her, it had left more than just an empty space in their bed. It had taken away their anchor, their sense of direction. The plant closure 6 months ago had been the final blow. 23 years on the assembly line, and they'd handed him a pink slip and a handshake. The severance pay had lasted exactly 2 months before the medical. Bills from Angela's final hospital stay ate through what remained of their savings. The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday, the eviction on a Friday. By Monday, they were living in the truck. "Look, Daddy." Jaden pointed ahead where the trees finally opened into a small clearing. The cabin sat in the center of the space like a broken tooth. It had probably been built in the 1940s or 1950s, constructed from logs that had once been straight and true, but now sagged under decades of weather and neglect. The roof showed patches of green moss and several missing shingles. One of the front windows had been boarded over with plywood, while the other stared out like a blind eye. But it had 4 walls and a roof. And it was theirs. Terrence pulled the truck up beside what had once been a front porch. The steps groaned under his weight as he climbed them, key in hand. The brass key looked newer than anything else about the place, as if someone had recently changed the locks. Why would anyone bother securing an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere? The door swung open with a sound like a sigh. The smell hit him first, not the mustiness he'd expected, but something cleaner, like pine needles and wood smoke. Someone had been living here, and recently. The main room held a stone fireplace with cold ashes in the grate, a rough wooden table, and two mismatched chairs. Dishes sat clean and stacked beside a hand-pumped well. A kerosene lantern hung from a hook near the window. "Hello?" Terrence called out. "Anyone here?" No answer, but something made the hair on his arms stand up. The sensation of being watched, of eyes tracking his movement through the dim interior. Jaden pushed past him into the cabin, his sneakers loud on the plank floor. "This is cool, Dad. Look, there's a real well inside." "Don't touch anything yet," Terrence warned, though he was already relaxing. Whoever had been staying here was clearly long gone. Probably some drifter who'd broken in during the winter and moved on when spring came. A hand-carved wooden cross hung above the back door, dark with age and bearing scratches that looked like claw marks. Below it, someone had scratched words into the doorframe. "May God protect this house and all who dwell within." The religious sentiment should have been comforting, but something about the desperate way the letters had been carved suggested prayers born of fear rather than faith. "Dad, come look at this." Jaden had found a back bedroom barely large enough for a single bed. The walls were covered with drawings, not painted or hung, but carved directly into the wood with what must have been a knife. They showed trees and animals, but also stranger things, symbols that looked almost Native American but somehow wrong, as if someone had tried to remember sacred designs but gotten the details confused. "Who you think made these?" Jaden traced one of the symbols with his finger. "I don't know, son, but we'll make this place our own soon enough." They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading their few possessions from the truck. Everything they owned in the world fit into 6 cardboard boxes and 2 duffel bags. It was a depressing inventory of a life reduced to its absolute essentials, but Terrence tried to focus on the positive. They had shelter, 40 acres of land, and enough distance from their old life that the collection agencies would have trouble finding them. As evening approached, Terrence got a fire going in the stone fireplace while Jaden explored the cabin's 2 small rooms. The boy had always been adaptable, rolling with the constant moves and changes that had marked the past year. Too adaptable, maybe. Children should have stability, friends, a sense of belonging somewhere. This cabin in the middle of nowhere was hardly the fresh start Terrence had envisioned for his son, but it was what they had. "Dad?" Jaden appeared in the doorway, his voice smaller than usual. "I found something." He held up a child's drawing, done in crayon on a piece of brown paper bag. It showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a house, a man, a boy, and a girl with long dark hair. Above them, someone had written in careful block letters, "My new family." Terrence felt his stomach drop. "Where did you find this?" "Under the bed in the small room. There's more stuff there, clothes and things." They found the cache together, a few items of children's clothing folded neatly in a wooden crate, along with more drawings and a small collection of smooth river stones. The clothes were for a girl of perhaps 10 or 11, well worn but clean. Everything had been arranged with care, as if someone expected to return for them. "Maybe she just went to town," Jaden suggested hopefully. "Maybe she'll come back." Terrence hoped not. The last thing they needed was complications with some runaway kid or her angry parents. But as full darkness settled over the forest, he found himself listening for sounds outside the cabin. The woods were never truly quiet. There were always night birds calling, small animals rustling through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. But tonight, the sound seemed different somehow, more purposeful. He was building up the fire for the night when he heard it, a soft knocking at the front door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Patient. Terrence grabbed a poker from beside the fireplace and motioned for Jaden to stay back. "Who's there?" No answer, but the knocking came again. The same rhythm, the same patient cadence. He approached the door carefully, poker ready. The brass key was still in the lock. He turned it, hearing the mechanism click. Then, taking a deep breath, he pulled the door open. A girl stood on the porch. She was maybe 12 years old, with long dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her feet were bare, despite the October chill, and her clothes, a faded flannel shirt and torn jeans, were too big for her slight frame. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were dark and knowing, holding depths that belonged to someone much older. "Hello," she said quietly. "I live here." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jaden pushed past his father, his face lighting up with recognition. "You're the girl from the drawing. I found your stuff." She looked. Terrence found his voice. "What's your name? Where are your parents?" "My name is Naya." She tilted her head, studying him with those unsettling eyes. "I don't have parents anymore." "Not for a very long time. How long have you been living here?" "Always," she said, as if it should be obvious. "This is my home." She stepped past him into the cabin, moving with a confidence that suggested intimate familiarity with every board and beam. Jaden followed her eagerly, already launching into questions about the drawings and the river stones. Terrence closed the door and turned the lock, though he was no longer certain what he was trying to keep in or out. The girl Naya settled into one of the chairs by the fire as if she belonged there. In the flickering light, her features seemed to shift and change, sometimes appearing fully human and sometimes suggesting something wilder, more elemental. "You're safe here," she told them both, her young voice carrying an odd authority. "Safer with me than without me. The forest can be dangerous for those who don't understand its rules." "What kind of rules?" Terrence asked. She smiled, and for just a moment, her teeth seemed too sharp. "The old rules. The ones that were here before houses and roads and people who think they own the land." Outside, something howled in the distance. Not a wolf or coyote, but something else entirely. The sound raised the hair on Terrence's neck and made him grip the poker tighter. Naya noticed his reaction and nodded, approvingly. "You have good instincts." "That's important here?" As the night deepened around them, Terrence found himself wondering what exactly he'd bought for $5. It wasn't just a cabin, that much was becoming clear. He'd purchased something far more complicated, something that came with responsibilities he didn't yet understand, and a strange, wild child who spoke of old rules and dangerous forests. But looking at Jaden's face, bright with curiosity and something like happiness for the first time in months, Terrence made a decision that would change all their lives. "Well then," he said, settling into the other chair by the fire, "I guess we're all living here now." Naya smiled, a real smile this time, without the unsettling edge, and for the first time since Angela's death, Terrence felt like they might have found their way home. The journal had been hidden beneath loose floorboards in what used to be a pantry, wrapped in oilcloth like something precious. Terrence found it 3 days after Naya had appeared on their doorstep, while trying to assess what repairs the cabin would need before winter set in properly. The leather cover was cracked and stained, and several pages had been torn out so violently that only jagged fragments remained. He almost put it back without reading it. The privacy of previous occupants should be respected, even if they'd abandoned the place. But something about the way those pages had been ripped out with such force that the binding was damaged made him curious. The first entry was dated 18 months ago. Day 1. Found this place through the county records. Previous owner died intestate. No heirs. Perfect for what we need. Sarah thinks I'm crazy for bringing the kids this far from town, but she doesn't understand. The doctors in Missoula can't help Jessica anymore. If the old stories are true, if there really are places where the boundary is thin, maybe we can find another way. Day 3. Jessica's episodes are getting worse. She speaks languages she's never heard, draws symbols she's never seen. The physicians want to commit her to the state hospital. They don't understand that this isn't illness. This is something else entirely. Day 7. We found her, the girl who lives in the forest. Jessica calls her the guardian. She won't come near the house, but she watches from the trees. Jessica seems calmer when she's around. Terrence flipped through several pages, finding more entries documenting a family's desperate attempt to help their disturbed daughter. But then, the handwriting changed, becoming more frantic. Day 23. It's not helping Jessica. It's changing her. She speaks to things we cannot see. The forest answers her in voices that make my skin crawl. Sarah wants to leave, but Jessica refuses to go. She says the guardian needs her. Day 30. Animals had been found drained of blood in perfect circles around the cabin. The local sheriff says it's predators, but what predator arranges its kills in geometric patterns? The guardian is teaching Jessica things no child should know. Day 35. Jessica drew a map today. It shows tunnels beneath our cabin, extending for miles through the mountainside. When I asked her how she knew about them, she said the guardian showed her in dreams. I found the entrance behind the woodshed. The smell that came up from below. Several pages had been torn out here. When the entries resumed, the handwriting was barely legible. Day 47. Sarah is gone, disappeared in the night without a trace. Jessica says she went into the tunnels to find the source. The guardian won't explain what that means. I can hear voices down there now, calling my name. Day 52. The guardian told me the truth today. This land is cursed, and she is bound to it as punishment for sins committed generations ago. She feeds on the life force of those who stay too long. Sarah is still alive, but she's changing, becoming something else. Jessica will be next unless I do something. Day 56. I tried to take Jessica and run, but the forest won't let us leave. Every road leads back here. The guardian says we're part of it now, part of the pattern that keeps her anchored to this world. But I found something in the old tribal records at the library. A way to break the binding if I'm strong enough. If I can find the right sacrifice. Day 60. I hid the ritual knife beneath the foundation. If someone else comes here, if they're strong enough to resist her initial charm, maybe they can finish what I started. The symbols Jessica drew are part of a larger pattern, a prison made of flesh and blood and will. It can be broken, but the entry ended abruptly. The remaining pages were either blank or torn out entirely. Terrence set the journal aside with hands that weren't quite steady. Outside, he could hear Jaden and Naya playing some sort of game, their laughter echoing through the trees. It sounded innocent enough, but now he found himself listening more carefully to the cadence of their conversation, noting how often Nia's responses seemed to come from someone much older than 12. The ritual knife mentioned in the journal, could it be real? And if so, what exactly was its purpose? He found his answer when he went to check the cabin's foundation an hour later. The stones were solid enough, but behind the building, near the root cellar, several of the foundation blocks had shifted. When he moved them aside, his fingers found the wrapped bundle the journal's author had described. The obsidian blade was beautiful in its lethality, ancient beyond measure, with symbols carved into the handle that matched some of the drawings on the cabin walls. The moment his skin touched the stone, he felt a jolt of energy run up his arm. Not electricity, but something deeper and more primal. You found it. Terrence spun around to find Naya standing behind him, her expression unreadable. This close, he could see that her eyes weren't quite human. The pupils were too large. The irises flecked with gold. You knew it was there? I've been waiting for someone to find it. She approached slowly, her attention fixed on the blade. For someone strong enough to use it. The journal says you feed on people. That you're some kind of monster? Naya completed the word without offense. In some ways, yes. but not by choice. She sat on a fallen log, suddenly looking every bit the lost child she appeared to be. My real name is Ayana. I was born to the Salish people in 1847. When the white settlers came to this valley, they brought disease and violence. My family died in the first wave of smallpox. I was 11 years old and alone. The forest around them had gone completely silent, as if the trees themselves were listening. The settlers claimed this land and built their homes on our burial grounds. But the dead don't rest easy when their bones are disturbed. The spirits rose up in anger, killing livestock and destroying crops. The settlers grew desperate. They needed someone to blame, someone to sacrifice to appease what they'd awakened. They chose you. They chose me. Her voice carried the weight of decades. They bound me to this place with ritual and blood, making me a guardian against the very spirits their desecration had created. I was meant to contain the darkness, to keep it from spreading beyond these mountains. But the binding changed me, twisted me into something that needs life force to survive. The families in the journal. I tried to warn them away. I always try. But some people won't listen, and the hunger gets so strong. She looked at him with ancient eyes. I don't want to hurt you or your son. I like you. You remind me of my father. Terence hefted the obsidian knife. This can break the binding? It can. But using it might release things far worse than me. The spirits I've been containing for over a century, they remember what was done to them. They remember their anger. And if I don't use it? Naya was quiet for a long moment. Eventually, the hunger wins. It always does. You and Jaden will join the others in the tunnels, and I'll wait for the next family to find this place. What others? Instead of answering, she led him to the root cellar behind the cabin. The wooden door was newer than the rest of the structure, secured with a heavy padlock. Naya produced a key from somewhere in her clothing. The smell hit him first, not decay, but something stranger. Sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Stone steps led down into darkness that the afternoon sun couldn't penetrate. Bring the lantern from the cabin, Naya instructed. When he returned with light, she guided him down into a chamber that had been carved from the living rock. The walls were covered with the same symbols he'd seen throughout the cabin, but these were painted in what looked like dried blood. And along the walls, arranged as carefully as books in a library, were dozens of human skeletons. They're not dead, Naya said quietly. Not exactly. The binding preserves them between life and death, using their energy to maintain the prison that holds both me and the angry spirits. They dream endless dreams and feel no pain, but they cannot move on to whatever comes next. Terence counted at least 30 skeletons, including several that were child-sized. How many families have come here? It's too many. The county keeps selling the property because no one stays long enough to establish legal residence. The deed gets put back on the auction block every few years, and someone else with nowhere else to go makes the same mistake you did. A sound from above made them both freeze. Jaden calling for his father, his voice tinged with worry. Dad? Dad, where are you? He's starting to change, Naya observed. Children are more sensitive to the spiritual energy here. He'll develop abilities, but that also makes him more vulnerable to being consumed. They climbed back up into sunlight that seemed less warm than before. Jaden was waiting by the cabin, his face pale with anxiety. I felt something weird, he told his father. Like someone walking over my grave, you know? And I could hear voices whispering in the trees. Naya knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. You're becoming aware of the other layers of this place. That's a gift, but also a danger. The spirits here are hungry and restless. Some of them might try to use you as a way back into the physical world. Is that bad? It could be. That's why you need to stay close to me or your father. I can protect you from them, but only if you listen when I tell you something is dangerous. Jaden nodded solemnly, accepting her warning without question. But Terence noticed how the boy's eyes had begun to reflect light differently, like an animal's eyes caught in a flashlight beam. That night, after Jaden had fallen asleep by the fire, Terence sat outside with Naya and the obsidian blade between them. Above, the stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, but somehow their light seemed to stop just short of reaching the ground around the cabin. "Tell me about the ritual," he said. "It's dangerous." "The blade has to be used at the exact spot where I was bound, a clearing about 2 miles north of here. The binding can only be broken by someone who freely chooses to risk their life for another's freedom. It requires a sacrifice of will and intention, not necessarily of life itself, but the chance of death is very real. And if it works? If it works, I'm free to move on to whatever comes after this world. The spirits I've been containing are also released, but without the binding's constraints, they might choose peace over revenge. It's possible they'll simply fade away once they're no longer trapped. And if it doesn't work..." Naya's smile was sad and ancient. "Then you die, and I remain bound here for another generation. Your son becomes like the others, suspended between worlds until someone else is strong enough to try again." Terence looked through the cabin window at Jaden sleeping peacefully by the fire. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether they'd have enough money for groceries. Now he was contemplating a ritual that might free a cursed guardian or might destroy them all. But when he looked at Naya, really looked at her, past the supernatural aspects to the frightened child underneath, he saw something familiar. The same desperate hope he'd carried for months after Angela's diagnosis. The same refusal to accept that some situations couldn't be fixed through love and determination. "We'll find another way," he said finally. "There is no other way. This is the only path that doesn't end with you and Jaden joining the others below. Then we'll make one." Naya studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I have to. That's what fathers do. They find ways to protect their children, even when it seems impossible. What if your child is me?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. Terence thought about the journal he'd found, about families that had come here seeking help or refuge and found only tragedy. But he also thought about Jaden's laughter earlier that day, and how Naya had joined in with the genuine joy of a child who'd been alone too long. "Then, I find a way to protect you too." In the distance, something howled, not quite wolf, not quite human, but something caught between the two. Naya tensed, her head tilting as she listened to sounds Terence couldn't hear. "They know about the blade," she said. "They can sense when their prison might be opened. Things will get more dangerous now." "What kind of things?" "The kind that hunt in packs and remember what it feels like to be murdered in their sleep." As if summoned by her words, shapes began moving at the edge of the clearing, shadow forms that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. Their eyes reflected the cabin's lamplight like stars fallen to earth. Terence gripped the obsidian blade tighter. Whatever he bought for $5, it was clear the price was just the down payment. The real cost was yet to be determined. Asterisk. The silver locket had been tucked behind a loose stone in the fireplace, hidden so well that Terence might never have found it if Jaden hadn't been helping him clean out old ashes and debris. When the boy's small fingers closed around the tarnished chain, the locket fell open with a soft click that seemed to echo through the cabin like a gunshot. Inside, where a photograph should have been, was something impossible. The miniature portrait showed a family man, woman, and 2 children, but the faces moved. Not like a film or video, but like a living memory caught in silver and glass. The man's eyes tracked left and right as if searching for something. The woman's mouth moved in what might have been a scream or a prayer. The children reached toward the viewer with desperate, grasping hands. "Dad?" Jaden's voice was small and uncertain. "What is this?" Terence took the locket carefully, expecting the illusion to fade under closer examination. Instead, the moving portrait became even clearer. He could see tears on the woman's face now, could see the children's lips forming words he couldn't hear. Naya! He called Dot. She appeared in the doorway so quickly that she might have been waiting just outside. Her eyes fixed on the locket immediately, and her expression grew grim. You shouldn't have found that. Not yet. What does it show? The Hendersons. They lived here in 1987 with their twin daughters. Before them were the Kowalskis, and before them the Chun family, and before them, she gestured vaguely. It shows them all eventually. Everyone who's ever lived here long enough to become part of the binding. As if responding to her words, the portrait flickered and changed. Now it showed a different family, an older couple with 3 grown sons. Their faces held the same desperate expression, the same silent pleading. They're not dead, Naya continued. I told you that yesterday. Death would be a mercy. They exist in a space between worlds, conscious but unable to act, aware but unable to speak. The locket shows them as they are now wrapped in endless moments of realization. Jaden reached for the locket again, but Terrence closed it firmly and tucked it into his pocket. The boy's eyes were already too bright, reflecting light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. We need to talk, Terrence told Naya, about what's happening to my son. They walked to the edge of the clearing while Jaden remained by the fire, sketching in a notebook he'd found among the cabin supplies. The boy's drawings had been getting stranger each day, less like a child's artwork and more like technical diagrams of things that shouldn't exist. The change is accelerating, Naya admitted once they were out of earshot. Usually it takes weeks or months, but Jaden is more sensitive than most. He's beginning to see the true nature of this place. And that's dangerous? It's necessary. But yes, also dangerous. The spirits trapped here aren't all benevolent. Some of them died angry and stayed that way. They see a child developing psychic abilities, and they think they've found their way back to life. As if to underscore her point, a sound echoed from the forest, not quite a voice, but something trying to form words with a throat that no longer had substance. How much time do we have before he's too changed to leave safely? A few days, maybe a week, before he becomes a target for the more malevolent spirits. She glanced back toward the cabin where Jaden sat drawing. That may have already begun. Then we use the ritual knife. Tonight. Terrence, no. You don't understand what you'd be risking. The binding doesn't just hold me, it contains dozens of angry spirits, some of them powerful enough to affect the physical world directly. If the ritual fails and they're released without restraint, then we make sure it doesn't fail. She studied his face in the failing light. You can't guarantee that. No one can. The ritual requires perfect intention, absolute commitment, and a willing sacrifice of something precious. Even then, success isn't certain. What kind of sacrifice? That depends on the person performing the ritual. For some, it might be their life. For others, it might be their memories, their connection to the world of the living, their ability to love or feel joy. The binding takes what matters most to you and uses it as payment for freedom, yours or mine. Terrence thought about this while they walked back toward the cabin. Through the window, he could see Jaden still drawing, his small face intense with concentration. What mattered most to him? The answer was obvious, but that made the choice no easier. There might be another way, Naya said quietly, but it's not without risks either. Tell me. I could teach you and Jaden to coexist with the binding instead of breaking it. Show you how to draw strength from the spiritual energy here instead of being consumed by it. You become like me, guardians of this place, protectors against the darker forces that want to escape, living forever as bezvoters, prisoners, living forever as family. The word hit him unexpectedly hard. Family. It had been just him and Jaden for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have others to care for and protect. Naya was strange and dangerous, But she was also a child who'd been alone for over a century, and Jaden had taken to her with the instant trust that children reserved for those they instinctively knew were safe. What would that mean? Exactly. Becoming guardians? You'd retain your human appearance and most of your human capabilities, but you'd also develop abilities similar to mine. Enhanced senses, the ability to communicate with forest spirits, limited control over natural forces. Jaden's changes would continue, but in a controlled way. He'd grow up knowing how to use his gifts safely. And in exchange, you'd be bound to this land just as I am. You could travel, but never far. You'd age much more slowly than normal humans, and you'd be responsible for maintaining the prison that keeps the darker spirits contained. They'd reached the cabin's front porch. Inside, Jaden looked up from his drawing and waved at them through the window. His smile was bright and uncomplicated, the smile of a child who trusted his father to make everything right. How long do I have to decide? Not long. The winter solstice is in 6 weeks. That's when the binding is strongest, and it's the only time of year when it can be safely altered. After that, we'd have to wait another year. And Jaden? By then, he'll either be fully integrated into the binding or she didn't finish the sentence. Or he'll be like the others in the locket, trapped between worlds with no way forward or back. That night, Terrence lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest and the whispered conversation between Jaden and Naya by the dying fire. They spoke in voices so low he couldn't make out words. But there was an intimacy to their communication that went beyond normal speech. Sometimes, Jaden would giggle at something Naya said, and sometimes she would make a sound that might have been a century of loneliness finally beginning to heal Dot around midnight. He got up to check on them and found Jaden fast asleep against Naya's shoulder. She was still awake, her strange eyes reflecting the firelight as she watched over the sleeping boy. He dreams of his mother, she said without looking up. She's been trying to reach him from wherever spirits go when they die. But the binding interferes with that kind of communication. You can see his dreams? I can see the dreams of anyone who stays here long enough. It's one of the gifts or curses of being a guardian. I know that she loved you both very much, and that she worries about Jaden growing up without her guidance. Terrence settled into the chair across from them. What does she tell him? To trust you, to be brave, to remember that love is stronger than fear or loneliness. Naya's smile was gentle and sad. She also tells him that he has a sister now, if he wants one. A sister? Me. If you choose the binding ritual instead of the breaking ritual, we be family in truth. Jaden would have someone who understands what it means to be different, to have abilities that set you apart from normal people. And you'd have someone to help you raise him, someone who knows this world and its dangers. The offer was tempting in ways that scared him, not just because of the practical advantages, but because he could see how much Jaden had flourished in the past few days. The boy was happier than he'd been since Angela's death, more confident and curious about the world around him. What about the spirits you're containing? The angry ones? They'd still be contained. The binding would just expand to include all 3 of us instead of just me. We'd share the responsibility and the power. It would actually be more stable than the current arrangement. And the cost? Your old life ends completely. You could never return to the human world. Never have normal relationships with people who don't understand what you've become. Jaden would grow up isolated from other children, though he'd have compensations abilities and knowledge that most people can't imagine. Outside, something moved through the trees with deliberate purpose. Not an animal. The footsteps were too regular, too intentional. Naya tensed, her head turning toward the sound. What is it? Someone's coming. Someone who doesn't belong here. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the firelight's reach. A voice called out, gravelly and authoritative. This is Sheriff Coleman. I need to speak with whoever's inside. Terrence rose and moved toward the door, but Naya caught his arm. Be careful. He's not entirely human anymore. What do you mean? He's been exposed to this place for too long. The townspeople, they know about the binding, about what happens here. Some of them have made their own bargains with the forces involved. The sheriff called out again, more insistent this time. I know you're in there. We need to talk about your situation. Terrence opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand on the obsidian blade in his pocket. The man standing in the clearing was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a standard sheriff's uniform that looked incongruously normal against the backdrop of supernatural wilderness. But his eyes held the same unnatural reflectiveness that Terrence had noticed in Jaden's. Sheriff Coleman, the man introduced himself, not moving closer to the cabin. I'm here to check on your welfare and discuss some concerns that have been raised. What kind of concerns? The kind that arise when people move on to cursed land without understanding what they're getting into. Coleman's smile was friendly enough, but it didn't reach his eyes. May I come in? It's a conversation best had in private. Terrence glanced back at Naya, who shook her head slightly. We can talk here. What exactly do you need to know? How you're adjusting to life here. Whether you've encountered anything unusual. Whether you might be interested in a mutually beneficial arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Coleman stepped closer, and in the lamplight, Terrence could see that the man's skin had an odd, waxy quality. The people of Clearwater, that's the nearest town. About 20 miles south, we've had an understanding with the guardian of this place for many years. She keeps certain forces contained, and we ensure that she has what she needs to maintain that containment. And what does she need? Families. People who can provide the spiritual energy necessary to power the binding. In exchange, those families are protected from the worst effects of the curse. They live comfortably, their needs met, their children educated in ways that normal schools can't provide. Behind him, Terrence heard Naya make a soft sound of disgust. He's lying, she said quietly. The town doesn't protect anyone. They feed people to the binding to keep it from spreading beyond these mountains. Coleman's hearing was apparently better than human normal. The guardian has her perspective, of course. But ask yourself, what has she told you about your options? Has she mentioned that there are alternatives to the choices she's presented? Such as relocation. The county is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement in exchange for relinquishing your claim to this property. Enough money to start over somewhere safe, somewhere normal. All you have to do is walk away. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. And a catch? No catch. Just the understanding that what happens here stays here. You forget what you've seen, and you never speak of it to anyone. What about her? Terrence nodded toward Naya. Coleman's expression hardened slightly. The guardian remains where she belongs. She served her purpose for over a century. Her situation is not your concern. She's a child. She's a bound spirit that feeds on human life force. Don't let appearances fool you into thinking she's something she's not. Jaden stirred in his sleep, mumbling something that sounded like a warning. Coleman's attention shifted to the boy, and his eyes took on an acquisitive gleam. Your son is developing abilities. I can see it from here. In town, we have others like him, children who've been touched by the supernatural, but trained to use their gifts constructively. He'd have peers, teachers, a future that doesn't involve being consumed by forces beyond his understanding. At what cost? No cost. Just cooperation. Naya stepped forward, placing herself between Coleman and the sleeping child. Tell him what happened to the last family who cooperated. Tell him about the Hendersons and their twin daughters. Coleman's mask of friendliness slipped slightly. The Hendersons chose to stay. They understood the benefits of working with the system rather than against it. They chose to stay because you drugged them with compounds that made them susceptible to spiritual possession. Their daughters are still alive, technically, but they're vessels for entities that should never have been allowed into human bodies. That's one interpretation of events. It's the truth. Coleman studied Naya for a long moment. And Terence got the impression that some kind of silent communication was passing between them. Finally, the sheriff turned back to him. "You have 48 hours to consider my offer. After that, the county's generosity expires, and you'll have to deal with your situation through other means." "What other means?" "The kind that don't end with everyone walking away happy." After Coleman left, Terence sat by the fire with the obsidian blade in his hands and tried to process what he'd learned. The townspeople knew about Naya and the binding. They'd been deliberately funneling families to this place, using them as some kind of spiritual fuel. And now they wanted Jaden for reasons that probably had nothing to do with his welfare. "The offer he made," Terence said. "Is it real? The money?" "Probably. The safety?" "Definitely not." Naya settled beside him, her young face grave with centuries and experience. "They'd relocate you somewhere nice, let you get comfortable, and then begin the process of harvesting Jaden's abilities. Children like him are valuable to people who know how to exploit supernatural gifts. And if we stay, then you have the choices I outlined before. Accept the binding and become guardians, or attempt to break it and risk everything." Terence looked at his son, still sleeping peacefully despite the supernatural negotiations happening around him. In a few days, Jaden had gone from a normal 8-year-old to something else entirely. But he seemed happier, more confident, more whole than he'd been since his mother's death. Was that worth the price of a normal life? "There's something else you should know," Naya said quietly. "About your wife. What about her?" "She didn't die of cancer." "Not entirely." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "The cancer was real, but it was encouraged, accelerated by spiritual interference. Someone wanted her out of the way so that you and Jaden would be more vulnerable, more likely to end up in a place like this." "Who?" "Why, I don't know who, but I can guess why. Jaden's abilities didn't manifest after coming here. They were always there, just suppressed. Someone has been planning this for a long time, orchestrating events to bring him to a place where his gifts could be properly harvested." The obsidian blade seemed to pulse in his hands, warm despite the stone's natural coldness. Angela's face swam in his memory, the way she'd fought so hard against an illness that should have been treatable, the way she'd whispered apologies in her final moments as if she'd somehow failed them. Can the blade bring her back? No, death is a one-way passage, even for objects of power. But it might allow you to speak with her spirit, to get answers about what really happened and what she wants for you and Jaden now. How? The ritual I described. It doesn't have to be used only to break or modify the binding. It can also be used to tear holes in the barrier between worlds. Dangerous holes, but holes nonetheless. Outside, the night was full of whispers and movement. Things that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely circled the cabin in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. The 48 hours Coleman had given them were already ticking away, and with each passing moment, their options became more limited. But for the first time since Angela's death, Terence felt like he might be close to understanding the forces that had shaped their lives. And understanding was the first step toward fighting back. The medicine bundle had been hidden beneath the cabin's foundation for longer than Naya had been bound to the land. Wrapped in deer hide and sealed with pine resin, it had waited through decades of weather and neglect for someone with the knowledge to recognize its significance. Terence found it while reinforcing the foundation stones, following Naya's directions to a specific spot where the earth felt different beneath his hands. The bundle was small, no larger than his fist, but it radiated warmth even through the protective wrapping. "Don't open it yet," Naya warned as his fingers found the leather ties. "The herbs inside are sacred to my people. They need to be exposed to sunlight and spoken words before they can be safely handled." "Your people?" "The ones who tried to save me before the settlers completed their ritual. They understood what was happening, but they arrived too late to prevent the binding. This bundle contains everything they brought for a rescue that never came. They carried it to the clearing behind the cabin, where autumn morning light filtered through the pines in golden shafts. Naya spoke in a language Terence didn't recognize, fluid syllables that seemed to make the air itself shimmer. As the words continued, the bundle began to glow with soft, silver light. "Now," she said, "dot inside the deer hide." Terence found items that seemed too mundane for their supernatural significance. Dried sage and sweetgrass, small stones in specific colors, a few feathers bound with sinew, and a piece of carved bone no larger than his thumb. But when his fingers touched each item, he felt echoes of the hands that had prepared them. Desperate hands, loving hands, hands that had worked with fierce hope against impossible odds. "My great-aunt made this bundle," Naya explained, touching the bone carving reverently. She was a medicine woman, one of the last who remembered the old ways fully. When the settlers began their ritual, she tried to counter it with ceremonies of protection and healing. What happened to her? They killed her first. They understood that she posed the greatest threat to their plans. The bone carving was covered with symbols similar to those Terence had seen throughout the cabin, but these felt different, warmer, more alive. When he held it up to the light, the symbols seemed to move and shift, telling a story in pictures rather than words. "This shows the binding ritual," Naya said, following his gaze, "but also its reversal. My great-aunt carved the knowledge of both ceremonies into the bone before she died, hoping someone would eventually find it and understand. Can you read it? Some of it? The language is older than my time, but the symbols are from the star knowledge, astronomy, and timing that my people use to determine the most powerful moments for spiritual work." She pointed to a series of carved dots and lines. "This section indicates that the binding can only be safely altered during specific celestial alignments. The winter solstice is one such time, but there are others. When's the next one?" "Tomorrow night. There's a conjunction of planets that happens only once every few decades. The barrier between worlds will be at its thinnest." Jaden appeared at the edge of the clearing, his notebook clutched in his hands. Over the past few days, his drawings had become increasingly complex, not just pictures anymore, but maps and diagrams that showed hidden aspects of their surroundings. "Dad, I drew something weird," he announced, holding up the notebook. "It's like I knew what to draw, but I don't remember drawing it." The page showed a detailed map of underground, tunnels extending far beyond what Terence had seen in the root cellar. The passages seemed to follow some kind of pattern, connecting natural caves with artificial chambers in a network that stretched for miles through the mountainside. "That's the old mine system," Naya said, studying the drawing. "The settlers weren't just farmers. They were mining silver from these mountains. They dug deep enough to break through into sacred caves, places where my people had conducted ceremonies for generations. Is that why the spirits are so angry? Partly. But the mining also weakened the barrier between worlds in this area. It created thin spots where things from other realms could more easily cross over. The settlers thought they were just extracting silver, but they were actually opening doorways." Jaden flipped to another page in his notebook. This drawing showed the cabin surrounded by geometric patterns that pulse with their own light. Lines of force connected the building to specific trees, rocks, and clearings throughout the forest. "These are ley lines," Naya explained. "Channels of spiritual energy that flow through the earth like invisible rivers." The cabin was built at the intersection of several major lines, which is why the binding ritual was so effective here, and why breaking it would be so dangerous. Terence added, "Exactly. Disrupting the energy flow at this junction point could have effects far beyond just freeing me from the binding. It might destabilize spiritual barriers for hundreds of miles in all directions." That afternoon, they were interrupted by an unexpected visitor. A figure emerged from the forest, an elderly, Native American man wearing modern clothes but carrying himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect. His hair was white as snow, braided with strips of leather and small bones. His eyes held the same otherworldly quality as Naya's, but tempered with warmth and humor. "Great niece," he said, addressing Naya in accented English. "You look exactly as you did the day they bound you to this place." Naya's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She ran to the old man and threw her arms around him, sobbing with a century's worth of accumulated loneliness and grief. He held her gently, speaking in the same fluid language she'd used to activate the medicine bundle. "This is Thomas Crowfeather," Naya said when she could speak again. "My great-aunt's grandson. I thought everyone from my family was gone." Thomas studied Terence and Jaden with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Some of us survived. We've been watching this place for generations, waiting for the right time to attempt a rescue." Recent. Events suggest that time may have come. What recent events? The spiritual activity in this area has increased dramatically in the past week. Animals are behaving strangely. The aurora borealis has been visible as far south as Colorado. And children with gifts like your sons have been having the same dreams of a girl trapped in a forest, calling for help. Jaden nodded vigorously. "I've been having those dreams. She shows me things, symbols and maps and places I've never been, because she's been reaching out through the spiritual network, looking for someone strong enough to anchor the rescue ritual from this side of the barrier." Thomas produced a leather pouch similar to the medicine bundle but larger and more elaborate. "I brought the tools and knowledge that my great-grandmother couldn't use in time, but the ritual requires participants on both sides, someone bound to this place, someone free to act as a bridge, and someone pure enough of heart to provide the spiritual energy needed for the working." He looked meaningfully at each of them in turn. "Naya provides the bound perspective. You, Terence, can serve as the bridge between human and spirit worlds. And your son, ... Double quotes, Thomas knelt beside Jaden, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your son has the rare gift of being able to channel spiritual energy without being consumed by it. That makes him invaluable for this kind of work. Is it safe for him? Safer than allowing the binding to claim him gradually. And much safer than trusting the people from town who want to harvest his abilities for their own purposes. You know about Sheriff Coleman?" Thomas's expression grew grim. "Coleman and his people have been corrupting the original purpose of this place for decades. What began as a containment ritual has become a feeding system. They deliberately lure families here to provide spiritual energy for their own supernatural activities." "What kind of activities?" "The kind that allow a small mountain town to prosper despite having no natural resources or economic advantages. Supernatural enhancement of crops and livestock. Weather control to prevent droughts and floods. Protection from natural disasters. They've built their entire community on power stolen from the families they sacrificed to the binding." The implications were staggering. How many families had been consumed over the years? How many children like Jaden had been fed to whatever machinery of spiritual exploitation Coleman's people had constructed? "The ritual tomorrow night," Terence said. "What exactly does it involve?" 3 phases, Thomas explained. "First, we open a channel of communication with the spirit world so that all parties can participate in the decision-making process. Second, we offer the bound spirit a choice freedom with the possibility of death, or continued binding with improved conditions. Third, we seal whatever choice is made with spiritual energy provided by willing participants. And if Naya chooses freedom, then she passes on to whatever comes after this life, and the binding is broken completely. The angry spirits contained here are also given the same choice piece or continued existence, in a form that doesn't require them to be imprisoned. And if she chooses to remain bound, then we modify the binding to include protections for your family. You become guardians together, sharing the responsibility and the power. The townspeople lose their ability to exploit this place, but the spiritual containment remains intact. As evening approached, strange lights began appearing in the forest. Not fireflies, the season was too late for that, but points of luminescence that danced among the trees like spirits made visible. Animals that should have been preparing for winter emerged from their dens and gathered at the edges of the clearing as if drawn by some invisible summons. "It's beginning," Thomas said. "The planetary alignment is creating resonances in the spiritual field. Tomorrow night, the barrier between worlds will be thin enough for us to attempt the rescue. What do we need to do to prepare? Fast from sunrise to sunset. Purify yourselves with sacred smoke. And most importantly, decide what you're willing to sacrifice for success. I thought you said the ritual didn't require death. Not death, necessarily. But it requires commitment. You'll be asking the universe to rearrange fundamental forces on behalf of people you've known for less than a week. That kind of request comes with a price." As night fell around them, Terence found himself thinking about the choices that had led them to this moment. The plant closure that had cost him his job, the medical bills that had consumed their savings, the foreclosure that had driven them from their home. Had any of it been coincidence, or had someone been orchestrating events to bring them exactly where they needed to be? Looking at Jaden, who was teaching Naya to play a simple card game by the fire, both children laughing with the easy intimacy of siblings, Terence realized that the question didn't matter. Whatever forces had brought them together, they were family now, and family meant you protected each other, no matter what the cost. The medicine bundle sat on the table between them, its contents arranged in the precise pattern Thomas had specified. Tomorrow night, they would discover whether love and determination were enough to break a curse that had lasted for over a century. Outside, the strange lights in the forest pulsed in rhythm with heartbeats they couldn't hear, and the gathered animals watched the cabin with eyes that reflected starlight like promises or warnings. Asterisk. The bone wind chimes had appeared overnight, hanging from the cabin's porch eaves like some macabre decoration. Made from the bleached remains of forest creatures, they created haunting melodies that spoke of ancient sorrows and long-held vigils. When Terence first saw them swaying in the morning breeze, his instinct was to cut them down, but Naya stopped him with an urgent gesture. "Don't," she warned. "They're not decoration. They're protection." Protection from what? From things that hunt by scent and sound rather than sight. The bones carry the memory of the animals they came from, deer who knew every hidden path, ravens who saw danger from above, wolves who could smell fear from miles away. When they sing together, they create a barrier that most predators won't cross. The chime's melody was unlike anything Terence had ever heard. Not quite musical, but not random noise either. Each bone contributed its own tone, and together they wove patterns that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to some deeper part of his consciousness. Sometimes the sound was comforting, like a lullaby sung by loving ghosts. Other times it carried undertones of warning that made his skin crawl. Who made them? Thomas, while we slept. It's one of the old protections, meant for places where the spirit world presses close to the physical realm. Winter was coming early to the mountains. The overnight frost had killed the last of the wildflowers, and the aspens were dropping their golden leaves in drifts that rustled with each breath of wind. But the cold wasn't entirely natural. It carried an emotional quality that suggested supernatural influences rather than simple weather patterns. Jaden had adapted to the changing environment with the resilience of childhood, but his adaptations were increasingly inhuman. His eyes now reflected light like an animal's, and he'd begun moving through the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for someone his size. More concerning was his growing ability to understand the chime's messages. "Something's coming from the south," he announced during breakfast, tilting his head toward the porch. "The bones are saying it's not alone, and it's not entirely alive." Thomas looked up from the sacred herbs he'd been preparing. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. They smell like the people from town, but wrong somehow. Possessed. Thomas said grimly. Coleman's people have been experimenting with voluntary spiritual possession, allowing lesser entities to share their bodies in exchange for enhanced abilities. Enhanced how? Increased strength, resistance to cold and injury, the ability to track supernatural quarry across great distances. But the process is dangerous. The entities they invite in aren't always willing to leave when their services are no longer needed. As if summoned by their conversation, figures began emerging from the tree line. 4 people in hunting gear, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack. Terrence recognized Sheriff Coleman in the lead, but the man's face was different now. The features sharper, the eyes holding an intelligence that wasn't entirely human. Washington. Coleman called out, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality. Time's up. We're here to collect what belongs to us. Nothing here belongs to you, Terrence replied, stepping onto the porch. The obsidian blade was heavy in his coat pocket, and the bone chimes sang a warning melody that made the hair on his neck stand up. The boy does. He's been marked for special purposes since before he was born. His mother understood that eventually. What did you do to my wife? Coleman's smile was inhuman in its configuration. We helped her fulfill her true purpose, producing a child with the right genetic markers for psychic sensitivity. The cancer was just a way to ensure he'd end up where he needed to be when his abilities manifested. Rage rose in Terrence's chest like a physical force. But before he could respond, Naya stepped out of the cabin behind him. Her appearance stopped Coleman and his companions in their tracks. She was no longer trying to appear entirely human. Her skin had taken on a silvery luminescence, and when she moved, the air around her shimmered with energy that made the landscape itself seem more vivid and alive. You have no authority here, she told Coleman, her child's voice carrying the weight of centuries. This land recognizes older laws than the ones written in your county books. We have an agreement, Guardian. You provide containment for the restless spirits, and we provide you with the life force needed to maintain your bindings. The Washington family falls under our jurisdiction. Our agreement was made under false pretenses. You told me the families would be protected, not consumed. They are protected. They achieve a form of immortality through integration with the spiritual matrix. What more could anyone want? Thomas emerged from the cabin carrying his medicine pouch and a staff carved with protective symbols. The possessed humans tensed at his appearance, their borrowed senses apparently recognizing him as a genuine threat. Thomas Crowfeather, Coleman said with mock courtesy. We wondered when you'd show up. Your great-grandmother was a thorn in our side a century ago. We'd hoped her family line had learned better sense. My family line remembers. What yours is tried to forget that some prices are too high to pay, no matter what they buy. Prosperity, safety, a future where our children don't have to scrape by on subsistence farming and seasonal tourism. I'd say those benefits justify the methods. The conversation was interrupted by a sound from the forest, a howling that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, but carried undertones of both. The possessed humans turned toward the sound with expressions of unease that their supernatural passengers couldn't entirely suppress. What was that? One of them asked. The result of your meddling, Naya replied. Every time you force unwilling spirits into human bodies, you weaken the barriers that keep darker entities contained. Something has been trying to break through for weeks now, and your experiments have finally given it enough leverage. The howling came again, closer this time and accompanied by the sound of trees being pushed aside by something large. The bone chimes responded with a frantic melody that spoke of imminent danger. We need to get inside, Thomas said urgently. All of us. What's coming won't distinguish between friend and enemy. But Coleman's group was already backing toward the tree line. This isn't over, the sheriff called out. The boy comes with us, one way or another. The boy stays with his family. Terrence replied, but he was speaking to empty air. The possessed humans had vanished into the forest with inhuman speed, leaving only the scent of sulfur and burned leaves. The howling was coming from multiple directions now, as if whatever was approaching had divided into several parts or called others of its kind. The bone chimes' warning grew more intense, their melody becoming almost frantic. Inside, Thomas repeated. Now, they barely made it through the door before the clearing filled with shapes that defied easy description. They moved like smoke given weight and purpose, flowing around obstacles rather than moving through them. Where they touched the ground, frost formed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Shadow walkers, Naya explained, pressing her face against the window. Entities from the deep places between worlds. They're attracted to strong spiritual activity and feed on life force. Are we safe in here? For now, the cabin sits on sacred ground, and Thomas's protections are holding. But they'll wait. Shadow walkers are patient hunters. As if to confirm her words, the entities settled into positions around the cabin, becoming still as statues, but maintaining their vigilant watch. Hours passed, but they showed no sign of losing interest. How long will they wait? Terence asked, as long as necessary. Time means nothing to creatures that exist primarily in spiritual dimensions. So we're trapped. Until tomorrow night's ritual. If we succeed in breaking or modifying the binding, the spiritual disturbance should be enough to drive them away. If we fail ... double quotes. Thomas let the sentence hang unfinished. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. The shadow walkers never moved from their positions, but their presence created a pressure that seemed to squeeze the air itself. Even inside the protected cabin, breathing became difficult, and all of them found their energy flagging despite having done nothing but wait. Jaden was the first to notice the change in the entity's behavior. They're not just watching anymore, he observed, pressing his face against the glass. They're doing something. Looking out, Terence could see that the boy was right. The shadow walkers had begun moving in slow, deliberate patterns around the cabin. Not pacing or hunting, but tracing geometric shapes in the frost-covered ground. They're creating a containment circle, Naya said, her voice tight with worry. If they complete it, we won't be able to leave even if Thomas's protections hold. How long do we have? An hour, maybe 2. Depending on how complex a pattern they're creating. Thomas was already reaching for his medicine pouch. Then we accelerate our timeline. The ritual was meant to be performed tomorrow night. The planetary alignments aren't the only source of spiritual power. Emergency circumstances call for emergency measures. Is that safe? Safer than being trapped here when the shadow walkers complete their binding. At least if we act now, we maintain some control over the situation. As evening fell around them, the cabin became an island of warm light surrounded by creatures that belonged to no earthly ecosystem. The bone chimes sang their warnings continuously now, their melody taking on an almost desperate quality. But inside, 3 humans and 1 bound spirit began preparations for a ritual that would either free them all or destroy them completely. The shadow walkers' containment circle grew more complex with each passing minute, but so did the protective symbols Thomas was carving into the cabin's floor and walls. Whatever happened next, Terence realized there would be no going back to the simple life he'd imagined when he first saw the property deed for a $5 cabin in the woods. They had moved beyond the realm of ordinary human concerns into something far more ancient and dangerous. But looking at Jaden, who was helping Naya arrange the ritual components with the serious concentration of a child who understood the stakes, Terence felt a familiar certainty settle over him. This was his family, strange and supernatural as it had become, and he would do whatever was necessary to protect it. Asterisk. The mirror fragment came from Thomas's deepest medicine bundle, wrapped in black cloth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he finally unwrapped it as the shadow walker's containment circle neared completion, the piece of obsidian glass showed not reflections but truths and some truths were harder to bear than lies. This belonged to my great-grandmother, Thomas explained, handling the fragment with reverence that bordered on fear. She used it to see past the veils that separate different layers of reality. But be warned, it shows things as they truly are, not as they appear or as we wish them to be. Terence held the mirror carefully, expecting to see his own face looking back. Instead, the surface showed Jaden sitting by the fire, but not as he appeared to normal sight. In the mirror, the boy was surrounded by threads of silver light that connected him to points throughout the forest. His eyes held depths that seemed to stretch back through generations, and his smile carried the weight of knowledge accumulated across lifetimes. "What am I seeing?" "Your son's true nature," Naya said quietly. "He's not just developing psychic abilities, Terence. He's remembering them." "Remembering?" Thomas nodded gravely. "The mirror shows soul history, the connections that transcend individual lifetimes. Your son carries the spiritual essence of someone who lived long before his current incarnation." "Who?" "Show me," Naya whispered to the mirror fragment. The obsidian surface rippled like water, and the image changed. Now it showed two children, a boy and girl of perhaps 11 or 12, standing in a forest clearing that might have been the same one outside their cabin. They were dressed in traditional Native American clothing, and their faces were painted with symbols that seemed to move and breathe with their own life. The boy's features were unmistakably those of Jaden, but aged by knowledge and shaped by experiences that belonged to a different century. The girl was equally recognizable, Naya, but as she had been before, the binding transformed her into something caught between child and ancient guardian. "We were siblings," Naya breathed, her voice filled with wonder and grief. "In the time before the settlers came, before the binding ritual separated us across the boundaries of life and death." "That's impossible." "The mirror doesn't lie," Thomas said gently. "Souls often travel in groups, finding each other again and again across different lifetimes. What you're seeing is the spiritual truth that explains why Jaden adapted so quickly to this place, why his abilities manifested so strongly, and why you were drawn here despite every rational reason to stay away." The mirror's surface shifted again, showing a different scene, the original binding ritual that had trapped Naya in her current form. But now Terence could see what had really happened that night over a century ago. The settlers hadn't just sacrificed one child to appease the angry spirits they'd awakened. They'd torn apart a family, using the spiritual bond between siblings to anchor their containment spell more securely. The boy in the vision, Jaden, in his previous life, had tried to save his sister. He'd fought against the adult hands that held him back, screaming her name as she was dragged toward the ritual circle. But his efforts had only made the binding stronger, his love and desperation becoming part of the spiritual architecture that trapped her between worlds. "He died trying to reach me," Naya said, tears streaming down her face. "The settlers killed him when he broke free from their restraints. His blood and mine were used to seal the binding. And his soul went where souls go when their bodies die. But the trauma of separation, the guilt of being unable to save me, those emotions were strong enough to ensure that he'd return to this place eventually, in a new body when the time was right." Terence looked at his son with new understanding. Jaden's immediate acceptance of Naya, his rapid adaptation to supernatural circumstances, his instinctive knowledge of things he'd never been taught. It all made sense now. He wasn't just a gifted child. He was a brother returning to complete a rescue that had been over a century in the making. The original plan, Thomas explained, was to use the trauma of separation as a power source. Siblings torn apart by death, but still spiritually connected, it creates a kind of psychic battery that can be used to fuel large-scale supernatural workings, like containing dozens of angry spirits. Exactly. But the plan had a flaw. Souls that are bound together by love don't stay separated forever. Eventually, they find ways to reunite. even across the barriers between lifetimes. Outside, the Shadow Walkers had completed their containment circle. The geometric pattern they traced in the frost-covered ground now glowed with pale fire, creating a barrier that would prevent anyone from leaving the cabin's immediate vicinity. But instead of feeling trapped, Terrence found himself experiencing something like relief. All the running, all the uncertainty about their situation, all the desperate scrambling to understand forces beyond his comprehension. It was over. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be there. What happens now? He asked. Now we complete what was started over a century ago, Thomas said. But this time, we do it right. The ritual preparations were unlike anything Terrence had imagined. Instead of dark ceremonies involving blood and sacrifice, Thomas arranged elements that spoke of healing and wholeness, sacred herbs that promoted spiritual clarity, stones that had been shaped by generations of ceremony, water from springs that had never been contaminated by industrial runoff. Each component carried vibrations of peace and restoration. The original binding was created through violence and fear. Thomas explained as he worked. To undo it properly, we need to replace those energies with their opposites, love. Trust, willing cooperation between all parties involved. All parties? The spirits that have been contained here for over a century deserve a voice in what happens next. They've been prisoners as much as Naya has. Any lasting solution needs to address their situation too. As the ritual space took shape, Jaden began exhibiting behaviors that suggested his other lifetime was becoming more accessible to his conscious mind. He moved through the preparations with the confidence of someone who'd participated in similar ceremonies before, arranging items according to patterns he couldn't possibly have learned in his current life. Do you remember? Naya asked him during a quiet moment. Some of it. Not like watching a movie, more like remembering a dream. I know you were scared that night, and I tried to stop them from hurting you. But I wasn't strong enough. You were 11 years old. You did everything you could. This time will be different. This time we're working together instead of being used against each other. The mirror fragment revealed one more truth as the evening progressed. The real reason Coleman's people had been so determined to claim Jaden. They hadn't just wanted him for his psychic abilities. They'd somehow learned about his connection to Naya and planned to use that bond to gain control over the binding itself. With Jaden under their influence, they could have modified the containment ritual to serve their own purposes, turning the trapped spirits into a supernatural power source for their entire community. They would have made him into what I became, Naya said, her voice heavy with implications. A guardian bound to serve others' purposes, feeding on unwilling victims to maintain systems he had no voice in creating. But that's not going to happen. No, because this time, he has a father who won't let anyone use his child as a tool. As midnight approached, the 3 humans and 1 bound spirit gathered in the center of the cabin. Outside, the Shadow Walkers waited with inhuman patience, their containment circle glowing brighter as spiritual energy gathered within its boundaries. The bone chimes had fallen silent, their warning function replaced by a deeper purpose. They would serve as focal points for the ritual, channeling energy from the spirit world into forms that could be safely handled by the living. Thomas began the ceremony with words spoken in the old language, calling on powers that predated human settlement of the continent. The cabin filled with presence, not visible entities, but awareness that suggested they were no longer alone. The spirits of the land, the ancestors who'd walked these paths for generations, the guardians who'd maintained the balance between worlds, they were all here, ready to witness and participate in what happened next. Are you ready? Thomas asked, looking at each of them in turn. Terrence nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The plant closure and foreclosure that had driven them from their old life. Angela's death and the grief that had nearly broken them both. The desperate bid on a property that had seemed too good to be true. Every loss, every mistake, every moment of desperation had been a step on the path that led to this clearing, this cabin, this family that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. "We're ready." Naya took Jaden's hand on one side and Terrence's on the other. The boy completed the circle by grasping his father's free hand. Thomas stood in the center, the mirror fragment reflecting not their faces, but their souls. Past and present and future intertwined, in patterns that spoke of destiny and choice and love that refused to be conquered by death or time. The ritual began, with a sound like singing, not human voices, but the harmony created when spiritual forces aligned themselves with conscious intention. The Shadow Walker's containment circle flared brighter, but instead of trapping them, it began to serve as a protective barrier against the chaotic energies they were about to release. For the first time since Angela's death, Terrence felt like they were exactly where they belonged. Asterisk. The sacred fire bowl had been carved from a single piece of volcanic stone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Thomas placed it in the center of their ritual circle as the midnight hour approached, filling it with herbs and oils that would burn with flames of specific colors, each hue representing a different aspect of the spiritual forces they were about to invoke. "Before we begin," Thomas said, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting, "there are truths that must be spoken." The mirror fragment showed you part of the story, but not all of it. Terrence felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. What else? The connection between Jaden and Naya is real. They were siblings in a past life, torn apart by the binding ritual. But that's not the only reason you were drawn to this place. Thomas lit the herbs in the bowl, and silver flames began dancing above the stone rim. Your wife's death wasn't just the result of supernatural interference. It was a deliberate sacrifice, designed to ensure that you and Jaden would eventually come here at exactly the right time. I don't understand. Angela wasn't just Jaden's mother. She was the reincarnation of our great-grandmother, the medicine woman who tried to save Naya and her brother during the original binding ritual. Her soul has been working across lifetimes to orchestrate this moment, the chance to finally complete what she started over a century ago. The words hit Terrence like physical blows. Everything he believed about their recent tragedies, the job loss, the medical bills, the foreclosure, had it all been orchestrated by forces beyond his understanding? Had Angela known what was happening to her, chosen to sacrifice herself for some greater purpose? The cancer was real, Thomas continued gently, reading the anguish in Terrence's expression. But she allowed it to progress faster than it needed to, refusing treatments that might have extended her life. She knew that her death would set in motion the events that would bring you and Jaden here when the spiritual alignments were optimal for breaking the binding. She died for this? She died so that her children could be reunited and freed from a curse that has trapped them for over a century. In her final moments, she made a bargain with the spiritual forces that govern such things. Her life in exchange for the opportunity to set things right. Naya was crying openly now, tears streaming down her ageless face. I felt her presence when you first arrived. I thought it was just memory, but it was really her spirit guiding you to us. The fire in the bowl flared higher, and suddenly the cabin was filled with presence. Not visible, but unmistakably there, a warmth and love that Terrence recognized instantly. Angela's spirit hadn't moved on to whatever comes after death. She'd remained in the liminal spaces between worlds, waiting for this moment. "Hello, sweetheart," her voice whispered through the crackling flames. "I'm so sorry I had to leave you both, but there was no other way." Jaden gasped and reached toward the fire, his eyes wide with recognition and joy. "Mama, I'm here, baby. I've been watching over you, helping guide you to where you needed to be. Are you ready to help your sister come home?" The ritual that followed was unlike anything Terrence could have imagined. Instead of dark magic and blood sacrifice, it was an act of pure love. Three souls that had been separated by death and supernatural interference finally given the chance to heal the wounds that had bound them for over a century. Angela's spirit provided the bridge between the world of the living and the realm where Naya had been trapped. Jaden's connection to his past life gave him access to knowledge and power he'd never learned in his current incarnation. And Terrence's unwavering love for both his children, biological and spiritual, supplied the emotional anchor that kept them all grounded in the physical world. The binding began to dissolve as soon as the ritual reached its first crescendo. The spiritual chains that had held Naya in her liminal existence for over a century started to crack and fray, releasing energy that made the air itself shimmer with possibility. But as the old constraints weakened, other things began stirring in the depths of the forest. The angry spirits that had been contained by Naya's sacrifice sensed their prison beginning to crack. Some of them, the ones that had found peace over the long years of confinement, were content to fade away into whatever comes after. Unfinished business is finally resolved. But others had spent decades nursing their rage and hatred, turning their imprisonment into fuel for vengeance. "They're coming," Naya warned, her form beginning to flicker between the child she appeared to be and the ancient guardian she'd become. "Some of them won't choose peace." Through the cabin windows, Terrence could see shapes moving in the darkness. Not the patient shadow walkers who'd been watching them, but something far more aggressive. These entities had once been human, but their deaths had been so traumatic and their rage so intense that they'd become something else entirely. They moved with predatory purpose, drawn by the spiritual energy of the breaking binding like sharks scenting blood in the water. "The protective circle?" Terrence asked. "It will hold against most of them, but not all. Some have been gathering power for too long, feeding on the anger and fear of other trapped spirits." Thomas was already reaching for additional protective items from his medicine bundle, crystals and herbs that would strengthen their defenses. But even as he worked, more entities were emerging from the forest. Not just the human spirits that had been directly trapped by the binding, but older things that had been attracted to the area by the concentration of supernatural energy. Native spirits that predated human settlement, elemental forces that had been disturbed by the settlers' mining operations, fragments of awareness from the deep places where the boundary between dimensions was thin. "Can we stop the ritual?" Terrence asked. "Not without trapping Naya and Jaden in their current states permanently," Angela's voice replied through the flames. "The spiritual forces we've set in motion can't be simply turned off. They have to be completed one way or another. Then we finish this." The second phase of the ritual required each participant to make a conscious choice about their future. Naya could choose to pass on to the afterlife, finally free from her supernatural imprisonment. Jaden could choose to remain fully human, allowing his past life memories and abilities to fade back into unconsciousness. Angela could choose to move on to whatever comes after death, her mission finally completed. But the choices weren't independent. If Naya passed on, the binding would collapse completely, releasing all the contained spirits without restraint. If Jaden chose to forget his past life, the spiritual connection that powered the ritual would be severed, trapping everyone in their current states. If Angela moved on too soon, the bridge between worlds would collapse, potentially stranding Naya in an even worse situation than before. "There is another option," Thomas said as the attacking spirits pressed closer to their protective barriers. "You could choose to become a family in truth, not just for this lifetime, but permanently. Naya could take on full human form and remain with you. Jaden could retain his abilities, but use them as a normal part of his life, rather than as echoes from the past. And Angela could remain as a guardian spirit, watching over all of you, but not trapped in any single place or form." Angela's voice completed the thought. It would mean giving up any chance of a normal life. Jaden would grow up knowing he'd once been someone else, carrying the weight of memories that span more than one lifetime. Naya would have to learn how to be human again after over a century of existing as something else. And Terrence would be responsible for helping both children navigate the complexities of lives that transcended ordinary human experience. But, looking at them, his son and the girl who'd become his daughter through bonds stronger than biology, Terrence realized the choice had already been made. This was his family, supernatural and complicated as it was. Yes, he said simply. The word triggered the ritual's final phase. Energy that had been building throughout the ceremony suddenly erupted outward, washing over the attacking spirits like a tide of silver fire. Some of them were instantly dissolved, their accumulated rage no match for the love that powered the working. Others were given the same choice that had been offered to the family piece, or continued existence in a form that didn't require them to harm. Others that most chose peace. The few that didn't were contained by new barriers, not the prison-like binding that had held them before, but something more like a boundary, defining limits beyond which their influence couldn't extend. As dawn broke over the mountains, the cabin sat in a clearing transformed. The shadow walkers had withdrawn to whatever realm they called home. The bone chimes hung silent, their protective function no longer needed. And inside, a family sat by the dying fire, a father, a son, a daughter, and a mother whose love had transcended death to bring them all together. What happens now? Terrence asked. Now we learn how to be a normal family, Naya said, her form solidifying into that of a 12-year-old girl who'd been given a second chance at childhood. As normal as we can be, anyway. Will the townspeople leave us alone? They'll have to, Thomas replied. The binding they depended on for their supernatural advantages is gone. Their power structure just collapsed overnight. They'll be too busy dealing with that crisis to bother with you. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light through the cabin windows, Terrence felt something he hadn't experienced since Angela's death-complete peace. The running was over. The uncertainty was over. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, bound together by love that had proven stronger than death, time, or the darkest supernatural forces that could be imagined. They were home. Asterisk. The healing stone circle began manifesting at dawn, ancient markers rising from the earth, as if the land itself was celebrating their victory. Each stone bore symbols that told the complete story of what had transpired, not just the recent ritual that had freed them all, but the entire history of the binding, the suffering it had caused, and the love that had finally overcome it. Terrence stood among the emerging stones, watching his transformed family adapt to their new reality. Naya was experimenting with her restored humanity, marveling at sensations she hadn't experienced in over a century. The simple pleasure of feeling hungry, of noticing that her feet were cold, of yawning when she was tired. Each discovery brought fresh wonder to her ancient eyes. Jaden retained more of his supernatural abilities than originally planned, but they no longer felt like echoes from another lifetime. Instead, they were simply part of who he was, a boy who could communicate with forest animals, sense spiritual disturbances, and see through illusions that might fool others. The knowledge was integrated now, neither foreign nor overwhelming, but as natural as his ability to read or ride a bicycle. The townspeople will come eventually, Thomas warned as they prepared breakfast over the restored fire. Not Coleman and his inner circle. They're probably dead or fled by now. But ordinary people who depend on the supernatural advantages this place provided. They'll want to know why their luck has suddenly changed, why their crops aren't growing as well, why their protection from natural disasters seems to have evaporated. Are we in danger from them? Not immediate physical danger, but they may try to convince you to restore the old binding or to establish a new one that serves their purposes. Some of them will be genuinely desperate families who relied on supernatural prosperity to survive. Communities that have grown beyond what the natural resources of the area can support. Naya looked up from the simple pleasure of buttering a piece of bread. They made their choices when they decided to profit from others' suffering. The consequences are theirs to face. Even so, Thomas continued, it would be wise to prepare for visitors. Not all of them will accept no for an answer easily. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles could be heard approaching through the forest, multiple engines, moving slowly over the rough road that led to the cabin. Terence counted at least 3 different vehicles, which suggested this wasn't a casual visit. Asterisk, stay inside, he told the children, reaching for the obsidian blade that had become as much a part of his equipment as his wallet or keys. But Thomas shook his head. The blade's power is depleted. It served its purpose last night. Besides, these people aren't coming to fight, they're coming to beg. The delegation that emerged from the forest looked like refugees from a disaster zone. Their clothes were expensive but wrinkled, their faces haggard with exhaustion and fear. At their head walked a woman in her 60s, silver-haired, and carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Mr. Washington, she called out as the group approached the cabin. My name is Margaret Sinclair. I'm the mayor of Clearwater, and I represent the families who've called this valley home for generations. Terence stepped onto the porch but didn't invite them closer. What do you want? To understand what you've done and to ask if it can be undone. Why would I want to undo it? Mayor Sinclair gestured to the people behind her, men and women who looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. Because without the spiritual protections this place provided, our entire community is dying. Livestock are falling ill. Crops that should have lasted through winter are rotting in storage. The weather patterns that kept us safe from drought and flood have shifted, and our meteorologists can't explain why. You built your prosperity on the suffering of trapped spirits and sacrificed families. Did you think that would last forever? We thought it was a necessary arrangement. The alternative was watching our children leave for the cities, our elderly die of poverty and neglect, our way of life disappear entirely. Her voice carried genuine anguish. Yes, we made compromises with forces we didn't fully understand. But we did it to preserve something precious: communities where people still look after their neighbors, where children grow up knowing their grandparents, where the land and its people are connected by bonds deeper than economic convenience. Naya appeared in the cabin doorway, her youthful features grave with the weight of centuries. You preserved those things by feeding families to a supernatural prison. How many children, like me and my brother, died to support your way of life? We didn't know, one of the men in the delegation protested. Coleman and his people handled the details. We just knew that families who moved to the old cabin property tended to disappear, and that our situation improved each time it happened. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Jaden said, joining Naya in the doorway. His voice carried an authority that belonged to someone much older. It's easier to enjoy benefits when you can tell yourself they come from somewhere else. Mayor Sinclair studied the 2 children with growing understanding. You're not entirely human anymore, are you? We're exactly as human as we choose to be, Naya replied. Which is more than you gave the families you sacrificed to maintain your comfortable lives. Thomas emerged from the cabin, carrying his medicine pouch and walking stick. The delegation recognized him immediately. Several people actually stepped backward, as if his presence was somehow threatening. Thomas Crowfeather, Mayor Sinclair said with forced politeness. We should have expected you'd be involved in this. You should have expected consequences for your actions decades ago. The fact that they're finally arriving shouldn't be a surprise. Is there nothing we can do? No accommodation we can reach? Our children are innocent of their parents' choices. So were mine, Thomas replied, gesturing toward Naya and Jaden. And they paid the price for adult decisions they had no part in making. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Terence had ever witnessed. It wasn't conducted with words alone. but with spiritual forces that he could feel pressing against his consciousness. The townspeople weren't just asking for mercy. They were trying to use whatever supernatural influence they still possessed to compel cooperation. But the stone circle that had risen around the cabin provided protection against such manipulation. Their desperate psychic pressure simply dispersed harmlessly against barriers that drew power from the healed land itself. "You have a choice," Naya finally told them. "Accept that your era of supernatural advantage is over and learn to live as normal people do, or leave this valley entirely and start somewhere else. Those are your only options. And if we refuse, then you deal with the consequences of living on land that no longer tolerates the spiritual pollution you've created. The valley will reject you in ways that become progressively more unpleasant until you either change your ways or leave." To demonstrate her point, Naya gestured toward the vehicles the delegation had arrived in. The engines had died while they were talking, and now attempts to restart them produced only clicking sounds. The valley itself was enforcing her ultimatum. "How long do we have to decide?" Mayor Sinclair asked. "As long as you need," Terrence said, surprising everyone, including himself. "But you make your decision from a position of honesty, not manipulation. No more attempts to compel cooperation through supernatural pressure. No more schemes to restore the old binding under different terms. You want to remain in this valley. You do it as ordinary people accepting ordinary risks and limitations. And in exchange, the land won't actively work against you. You'll have the same chance any other community has to build something sustainable and decent." The delegation withdrew to discuss their options, their dead vehicles forcing them to make the journey on foot. As they disappeared into the forest, Terrence turned to find his family watching him with expressions of pride and approval. "You did well," Angela's voice whispered through the wind that stirred the pine branches overhead. "You chose mercy over vengeance, but mercy with boundaries. That's the mark of true strength. Will they accept the terms?" "Some will. Others won't be able to let go of the power they've lost. But that's their choice to make." As afternoon settled over the transformed landscape, strange visitors began arriving at the cabin. Not threatening entities this time, but spirits who'd been drawn by news of the healing that had taken place. Forest guardians who'd been absent for decades returned to investigate whether their sacred places were truly free from contamination. Animal spirits brought their living counterparts to drink from streams that ran clear for the first time in generations. Even the aurora borealis made an appearance, dancing across the mountain sky in broad daylight to celebrate the restoration of balance to the land. "It's beautiful," Naya breathed, watching the light display with eyes that reflected its shifting colors. "I'd forgotten how beautiful the world could be when it wasn't filtered through supernatural prison bars." Jaden was sketching the aurora in his notebook, but his drawings now show both the visible lights and the spiritual energies that powered them, layers of reality overlapping in patterns that told the story of cosmic forces celebrating a victory that had been over a century in the making. "What happens to us now?" he asked. "Do we stay here or can we go somewhere else if we want to?" "We can go anywhere we choose," Terrence replied, though he suspected they'd all discovered their true home. "But first, we finish making this place ready for whatever comes next." The stone circle was still growing, each new marker that rose from the earth adding to the network of protection and healing that surrounded the cabin. But these weren't prison walls. They were boundary markers that defined a sanctuary where the damaged could heal and the lost could find their way home. As evening approached, the family gathered around their fire to plan for a future that finally belonged to them. Outside, the land itself sang with the joy of spirits that had been freed from over a century of anger and pain. And somewhere in the spaces between the visible and invisible worlds, Angela's presence watched over them all with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally completed the most important work of any lifetime, ensuring that her children were safe, happy, and home. The new property deed arrived by special courier 3 days after the delegation's visit, and delivered by a nervous young man who seemed eager to complete his business and leave the valley as quickly as possible. The document was nothing like the weathered, suspicious paper Terrence had purchased at the county auction. This deed was crisp and official, bearing the seals of multiple government agencies and declaring the Washington family the rightful owners of not just the original 40 acres, but of nearly 200 acres of surrounding forest land. "I don't understand," Terrence said, examining the legal language that established their ownership in terms so absolute that future challenge seemed impossible. "Who authorized this?" "The state, the federal government, and 3 tribal nations," Thomas explained, having stayed to help them navigate the aftermath of their supernatural victory. When word spread that the old binding had been broken and replaced with healing, every authority with any claim to this land decided it was better to legitimize your presence than to risk having the area fall back into the hands of people who might try to restore the old arrangements. The deed came with additional documents that were even more surprising: federal recognition of the property as a spiritual sanctuary, tax-exempt status, and a substantial grant for maintaining what the paperwork delicately termed cultural preservation activities. Someone in Washington, D.C. clearly understood that certain places required special guardianship, even if they couldn't officially acknowledge the supernatural reasons why. "They're paying us to live here," Naya marveled, reading through the grant documentation. "The government is actually paying us to be a family. They're paying us to make sure nothing like Coleman's operation ever gets established here again," Thomas corrected. "There are people in various agencies who keep track of supernatural hotspots and work to prevent them from being exploited. Your success here has given them a model for how such places can be healed, rather than simply contained or destroyed." Jaden looked up from the notebook where he'd been sketching. The stone circle's continued growth. "Does this mean other families like us? Other places where people are trapped? More than you might think? The world is full of spiritual wounds that haven't healed properly. Places where trauma and injustice created supernatural problems that conventional solutions can't address. What you accomplished here, breaking a century-old curse through love and willing sacrifice, it's given hope to people who thought some situations were permanent. The implications were overwhelming. They'd solved their own family crisis, but apparently they'd also created a template that could help others facing similar supernatural imprisonment. The weight of that responsibility should have been crushing, but instead Terrence found it oddly comforting. Their suffering hadn't been meaningless. The losses they'd endured, the impossible choices they'd been forced to make, it had all served a purpose, larger than their individual circumstances. "We don't have to become professional Ghostbusters," Thomas assured them, reading the concern in Terrence's expression. "But this place will naturally attract people who need the kind of healing you've experienced. Lost souls, broken families, individuals whose lives have been disrupted by supernatural forces they don't understand. They'll find their way here, and when they do, you'll have the knowledge and power to help them." "What about school for the kids?" "That's been arranged too. There's a network of educators who specialize in children with unusual backgrounds and abilities. Naya will need time to adjust to functioning as a human child again, and Jaden will need guidance in managing abilities that most people don't possess. But they'll receive excellent educations, and they'll have the company of other children who understand what it's like to be different." As if to demonstrate the changes that had taken place, a family of deer emerged from the forest and approached the cabin without fear. The animals had been gradually returning to the area over the past few days, drawn by the restored spiritual health of the land. But these deer were different. They moved with purpose rather than simple animal instinct, and their eyes held intelligence that suggested they were more than ordinary wildlife. "Spirit guides," Naya explained, kneeling to offer her hand to the lead doe. "When the binding was broken, It freed more than just human souls. Animal spirits that had been trapped or corrupted by the supernatural pollution are also healing. The doe nuzzled her palm. And suddenly, Naya's expression changed. She tilted her head as if listening to something only she could hear, then nodded gravely. They're warning us. Mayor Sinclair's people have made their decision, and not all of them chose to accept the new limitations. What does that mean? It means some of them are coming back tonight, and they're not planning to negotiate. Thomas immediately began preparing defenses, drawing on protective traditions that predated European settlement of the continent. But his preparations were different from the desperate measures they'd used during the binding-breaking ritual. These protections were quieter, more integrated with the natural defenses the healed land itself provided. Will they be dangerous? Probably not to us directly. The stone circle provides excellent protection, and we have spiritual allies now who will respond if we're threatened. But they may try to damage the land itself, hoping to force us to restore the old arrangements. How could they damage the land? Pollution, both physical and spiritual. Fire, if they're desperate enough. Deliberate introduction of invasive species or toxic substances. There are ways to wound a place that go beyond simple violence. As evening approached, the family gathered in the cabin to wait and see what form the townspeople's desperation would take. The children were remarkably calm, their supernatural experiences having given them perspectives on danger that most adults never developed. But Terence found his nerves stretched tight, the protective instincts of fatherhood struggling with the reality that his children were no longer ordinary kids who could be shielded from adult problems. "I can feel them coming," Jaden announced, looking up from his latest sketch. This drawing showed human figures surrounding the cabin, but their forms were distorted by anger and fear. They're not trying to hide their intentions anymore. How many? 12, maybe 15. Some of them are carrying tools that feel wrong, things that have been touched by the old supernatural influences. Weapons? Not exactly. More like spiritual drain plugs. Things designed to pull energy out of the land and redirect it somewhere else. The attack, when it came, was unlike anything Terence had expected. Instead of direct assault, the townspeople began establishing what Thomas identified as spiritual siphons at key points around the property boundary. The devices were crude but effective combinations of technology and supernatural knowledge that began drawing power away from the stone circle and the healed land it protected. They're trying to starve us out, Thomas realized. If they can drain enough energy from this place, the protections will fail and the spiritual healing will begin to reverse. Eventually, conditions would become bad enough that we'd have no choice but to restore something like the old binding just to make the area livable again. Can we stop them? We can try, but it will require all of us working together. And it may mean using abilities in ways that could be dangerous. Naya was already moving toward the door. They're hurting the land. I can feel the pain of every tree and stone they're affecting. This has to stop. Wait, Terence called. But she was already outside, her form beginning to glow with the silver radiance that had appeared during the ritual. The sight of her approaching made the townspeople's work more frantic. They understood that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Jaden, stay inside, Terence ordered, but his son shook his head. She's my sister. If she's going out there, so am I. Before Terence could stop him, Jaden had joined Naya in the clearing. The two children stood side by side, their combined presence creating a field of energy that made the very air shimmer. The spiritual siphons began sparking and smoking as the power they'd been designed to steal was suddenly redirected back toward its source. Stop what you're doing, Naya called to the townspeople, her child's voice somehow carrying clearly across the distance that separated them. You're damaging things that can't be repaired. We won't let you destroy our home, Mayor Sinclair replied, her own voice distorted by whatever supernatural enhancements she'd used to amplify it. Our families have lived in this valley for 5 generations. We won't be driven out by strangers and their pet spirits, then learn to live here without feeding on others' suffering," Jaden said, his words carrying the authority of someone who'd witnessed the price of such arrangements firsthand. There are ways to prosper that don't require spiritual slavery. Easy words from children who don't have to worry about providing for families or protecting communities. The confrontation escalated as both sides drew on reserves of power that transformed the clearing into a battlefield of competing energies. The townspeople's siphons pulled at the spiritual foundations of the healed land, while the stone circle and its guardians pushed back with forces that spoke of justice and restoration. Caught between them, the forest itself began showing signs of distress: trees wilting, streams slowing, animals fleeing to areas less affected by the supernatural conflict. It was Angela's voice that finally cut through the chaos, speaking with the authority of someone who transcended the boundaries between life and death. "Enough. All of you, stop this before you destroy everything we've worked to heal." Her words carried such power that both sides found themselves unable to continue their attacks. In the sudden silence, the damage that had already been done became visible: patches of withered vegetation, cracked stones in the protective circle, spiritual siphons smoking with overloaded energy. "This is what hatred accomplishes," she continued, her presence making itself known through wind and light and the scent of flowers that had bloomed in defiance of the season. "Destruction of the very things you claim to be protecting. How is this different from what the original settlers did when they destroyed sacred sites to build their mines and farms?" The moment of silence that followed Angela's intervention stretched like a held breath. In that pause, both sides were forced to confront the reality of what their conflict had already cost. The spiritual siphons had burned out from the overload, leaving twisted metal and scorched earth where they'd been placed. Several stones in the protective circle showed spiderweb cracks, and patches of forest showed the withered brown of vegetation that had been drained of life force. Mayor Sinclair was the first to speak, her voice small and exhausted. "We didn't want it to come to this. We can't lose everything we've built. What you built was supported by the suffering of innocent families." Angela's presence replied, her words carried by wind that smelled of pine and distant rain. That foundation was always going to crumble eventually. The only question was whether you'd help it fall gracefully or fight the collapse until it destroyed everything around. Naya stepped forward, her silver luminescence dimming to a soft glow that was less intimidating but no less powerful. "There's still time to choose differently. The land isn't rejecting you because you're unwelcome. It's rejecting the methods you've used to prosper here. What methods would you have us use?" One of the younger townspeople asked, genuine desperation in his voice. "Farming barely sustains a family anymore. Tourism is seasonal at best. Without the advantages the old arrangement provided, most of us will have to leave just to survive." It was Thomas who answered, drawing on wisdom accumulated across decades of helping communities transition away from supernatural dependencies. "The same methods people use everywhere else: cooperation, innovation, sustainable resource management. Hard work that builds something lasting instead of quick fixes that require constant feeding with others. Pain. And if we can't make that work, then you move somewhere else, the same way people have always done when local conditions no longer supported their way of life. But you don't create new victims to avoid that inconvenience." Jaden had been quietly studying the damaged spiritual siphons while the adults talked. Now he looked up with the serious expression that had become characteristic since his abilities had awakened. "These devices," he said, "they're not just pulling energy from the land. They're also pulling it from the people who made them. Look at yourselves, really look." Following his suggestion, the townspeople began examining each other with new awareness. What they saw was alarming. The men and women who'd participated in the attack looked years older than they had just hours before. Their skin was gray and drawn, their eyes sunken, their movements sluggish with exhaustion that went deeper than simple fatigue. Supernatural shortcuts always have a price, Thomas explained. The siphons were designed to drain energy from the land, but when that source was cut off, they began drawing from the next available reservoir, the life force of their operators. Are we dying? Not yet. But continued use of such devices would eventually kill you, and the process wouldn't be pleasant. Mayor Sinclair sank onto a fallen log, suddenly looking every one of her 60-plus years. Coleman never told us about side effects like this. He made it sound so simple, a mutually beneficial arrangement where everyone got what they needed. Coleman was using all of you the same way you were using the trapped families, Naya said. Not unkindly, but without softening the truth. He needed a population that was dependent on supernatural advantages so they wouldn't question his methods or look too closely at the cost of maintaining them. What happened to him? He died when the binding broke, Thomas replied. The spiritual parasites he'd allowed into his body couldn't survive, without the constant flow of energy the prison provided. They consumed him from within when their food source was cut off. The revelation that their leader was dead seemed to break the last of the townspeople's resistance. Several of them began crying, not just from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of being freed from choices they'd never wanted to make. We didn't know, Mayor Sinclair repeated, though the words sounded hollow even to her. We should have known, but we didn't want to know. The important thing is what you choose to do now, Angela's voice said gently. You can spend your remaining energy fighting changes that are already complete, or you can use that energy to build something better. How? It was Terrence who provided the answer, drawing on experiences from his own life that suddenly seemed relevant in ways he'd never expected. The same way anyone rebuilds after losing everything. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one act of mutual support at a time. I know what it feels like to lose your home, your job, your sense of security. But I also know that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning. What kind of beginning? The kind where you have to decide who you want to be when all the external supports are gone. Where you discover whether your community is built on genuine care for each other or just shared dependence on systems that benefit some people at others' expense. The conversation that followed stretched through the night, as 15 desperate people worked through the stages of grief for a way of life that was ending whether they accepted it or not. Some of them would leave the valley, seeking opportunities in places where their skills and resources could support more conventional lifestyles. Others would stay and attempt the difficult work of building a sustainable community based on cooperation rather than supernatural exploitation. But all of them had to reckon with the knowledge that their comfortable lives had been purchased with the suffering of families like Terrence's people, who'd been deliberately lured into situations where their pain and desperation could be harvested to benefit others. I'm sorry, Mayor Sinclair finally said, addressing Naya directly. I know that doesn't repair the harm that was done to you and your brother, but I need you to know that some of us genuinely didn't understand the cost of what we were accepting. I know, Naya replied, and I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying anger for over a century taught me that hatred hurts the person holding it more than anyone else. As dawn approached, the townspeople began the long walk back to Clearwater, leaving behind the burned-out remnants of their spiritual siphons as reminders of roads not taken. The forest began healing itself almost immediately, new growth pushing up through the scorched ground and the cracked stones in the protective circle slowly mending. Is it really over? Terrence asked, watching the last of the delegation disappear into the trees. This part is, Thomas confirmed. There will be other challenges. There always are when you're responsible for maintaining something as important as this sanctuary. But the existential threats are finished. Your family is safe. Your home is secure, and your purpose is clear. What purpose? The same purpose that brought you here in the first place, even though you didn't know it at the time. To be a family, to heal from wounds that seemed unhealable, and to help others do the same when they find their way to your door. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the transformed landscape, the Washington family stood together in their stone circle sanctuary. They'd fought for this peace, paid prices that no family should have to pay, and emerged stronger and more complete than they'd ever been when their lives were conventionally normal. The healing was complete, but the work of maintaining it and helping others find their own path to wholeness was just beginning. Asterisk. 6 months after the night that changed everything, the cabin bore no resemblance to the decrepit structure Terrence had purchased for $5. The logs had been restored to their natural golden color, the roof repaired with cedar shingles that would last another century, and the windows replaced with glass that somehow seemed to capture and hold the mountain sunlight. But the most significant changes were less visible, the sense of peace that permeated every corner of the building, the way visitors immediately felt welcome and safe, the warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature, and everything to do with love made manifest. In wood and stone, Naya had adapted to human childhood, with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing simple pleasures for the first time in over a century. She attended school 3 days a week, part of an experimental program for children with unusual backgrounds, and spent the other days helping Terrence manage the sanctuary that their home had become. Her legal adoption had been finalized through channels that Terrence didn't entirely understand but suspected involved the same government agencies that had provided their official recognition and funding. The girl who'd once been trapped between worlds now reveled in the most ordinary aspects of human existence. She'd discovered a passion for cooking, spent hours reading books that had been published during her century of imprisonment, and was learning to play guitar with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. But she'd retained enough of her supernatural abilities to serve as the sanctuary's primary guardian, sensing spiritual disturbances and guiding lost souls toward the healing they needed. Jaden had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds of muscle, his development accelerated by the resolution of supernatural conflicts that had been draining his energy since birth. His abilities had stabilized into something like a supernatural immune system. He could detect and neutralize spiritual threats without being overwhelmed by them, could communicate with non-human intelligences without losing his own identity, and could access memories from his past life when relevant knowledge was needed without being trapped by experiences that belonged to a different person in a different time. More importantly, he'd found his place in a family that finally felt complete. The nightmares that had plagued him since his mother's death were gone, replaced by dreams where he could visit with Angela in a realm where time moved differently and love transcended the boundaries between life and death. "She's proud of us," he told Terrence one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "She says we became exactly the family she hoped we'd become, just not in the way she expected when she first married you. Does she have any advice for handling tomorrow's visitors?" The family arriving the next day represented their 5th case since word had spread, through networks that normal people didn't know existed. A father whose teenage daughter had been possessed by something that psychiatric medicine couldn't identify or treat. Standard exorcism had failed, and the entity was growing stronger while the girl grew weaker. Desperate internet research had led him to stories about a place in Montana where impossible situations sometimes found unexpected solutions. She says to trust what we've learned and remember that every family situation is different. The methods that worked for us might not work for them, but the principles are universal. Love is stronger than fear. Healing is possible even for the oldest wounds, and family doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Terrence nodded, thinking about the techniques they'd developed over the past months. Thomas visited regularly to provide guidance and training. But increasingly, they've found their own approaches to helping families navigate supernatural crises. The stone circle served as both protection and amplifier, allowing them to create safe spaces where traumatized people could begin processing experiences that conventional therapy wasn't equipped to handle. Their success rate was remarkable, not perfect, but far better than anyone had dared hope. Families that arrived broken and desperate usually left whole and empowered, equipped with knowledge and techniques that would help them handle whatever challenges the future might bring. Word of their work was spreading through communities that existed in the margins between the normal world and places where normal rules didn't apply. How do you feel about having strangers in the house so often? Terence asked Naya as she joined them on the porch with a plate of cookies that had become her signature contribution to their hospitality efforts. "I love it," she said simply. For over a century, this place was associated with fear and loss, and people disappearing never to be seen again. Now it's associated with healing and hope and families being reunited. Every person we help makes the good associations stronger and the bad ones weaker. Transformation extended beyond their immediate property. The entire valley was healing from decades of spiritual pollution. Wildlife populations were recovering, streams ran clearer, and the weather patterns had stabilized into something more natural and predictable. Several of the townspeople who'd chosen to stay had found unexpected prosperity in ventures that didn't depend on supernatural advantages: organic farming, ecotourism, artisan crafts that commanded premium prices from buyers who valued authenticity and quality. Mayor Sinclair had become an unlikely ally, working to establish Clearwater as a model of sustainable rural development. The process hadn't been easy. Some families had indeed been forced to relocate when their unsustainable lifestyles could no longer be maintained. But the community that was emerging was healthier and more resilient than what it had replaced. "The government people want to study what we've done here," Thomas reported during one of his visits. "They're interested in developing protocols that could be applied to other supernatural hotspots around the country. Are we comfortable with that level of attention? As long as it helps other families and doesn't interfere with our primary mission, I think it could be beneficial. There are places where children like Naya and Jaden are still trapped, where communities are still dependent on spiritual exploitation, where healing is possible, but no one knows how to begin the process. The work wasn't without its challenges. Some situations they encountered were beyond their ability to resolve, requiring referrals to other specialists in the hidden network of people who dealt with supernatural problems. Some families weren't ready for the kind of transformation that true healing required, preferring to maintain familiar dysfunction rather than risk the uncertainty of fundamental change. And some entities they encountered were genuinely malevolent, requiring more aggressive intervention than their preferred methods of love and patience could provide. But for every failure, there were multiple successes. Children freed from spiritual attachments that had been draining their life force. Parents reunited with kids who'd been lost in realms between worlds. Families who'd been torn apart by supernatural interference, learning to function as units again. Communities that had been poisoned by exploitation of spiritual resources, finding ways to prosper through cooperation and mutual support. "I think about the other families who came here before us," Naya said during dinner one evening. "The ones whose energy was used to power the binding, who never got the chance to break free and heal. Sometimes I feel guilty about our happiness." "Don't," Terence replied firmly. "The best way to honor their sacrifice is to use the freedom they helped purchase to help others avoid similar fates. Every family we help, every situation we resolve, every bit of healing we facilitate, it's partly their victory too. Your mother feels the same way," Jaden added. "She says the spirits who were trapped here before the binding was broken are at peace now, and knowing that their suffering led to something good helps them move on to whatever comes next." As autumn approached their first anniversary in the sanctuary. The family began planning a celebration that would acknowledge both how far they'd come and the work that still lay ahead. Representatives from several Native American tribes would attend, along with government officials who specialized in supernatural oversight, academics who studied the intersection between spiritual phenomena and public policy, and families who'd been helped by the sanctuary services. But the heart of the celebration would be simple: a father, a son, a daughter, and the spirit of a mother whose love had transcended death to bring them all together. They'd started as refugees fleeing from loss and failure, purchased a cursed cabin for $5, and somehow managed to transform both their lives and an entire region through the simple but radical choice to treat supernatural problems with supernatural solutions based on healing rather than control. The new property deed sat framed on the mantel above their fireplace, but it was just paper. Their real ownership of this place came from the blood and tears and love they'd invested in its transformation, from the spirits they'd freed and the families they'd helped heal, from the simple decision to treat a haunted forest as a home worth fighting for. As evening settled over the mountains and the aurora borealis began its nightly dance across the sky, a phenomenon that had become regular since the bindings breaking, the Washington family sat around their fire and planned for a future that belonged entirely to them. They found their place in the world, discovered their purpose, and built something that would outlast any individual lifetime. Outside, the stone circle hummed with the quiet power of love made permanent, and the forest sang with the voices of spirits finally at peace. Inside, a family counted their blessings and prepared to help others discover that even the most impossible situations could be healed when approached with courage, wisdom, and the unshakable conviction that love really was stronger than any force that sought to divide or destroy. The $5 cabin had taught them that sometimes the best bargains come with the highest prices, but also with the greatest rewards. They'd paid those prices willingly and discovered that they'd purchased something far more valuable than real estate. They'd bought their way home to each other, and in doing so, they'd created a beacon for others who were still lost in the wilderness of supernatural crisis and spiritual displacement. The work would continue as long as there were families who needed healing, and as long as they had strength to provide it. But tonight, they were simply grateful to be exactly where they belonged, exactly when they were supposed to be there, surrounded by love that had proven stronger than curses, time, and even death itself.